Okay, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to Corpus Christi for allowing us to use the auditorium. I'll get straight to it and introduce the speakers. So on my far right is Colin Brewer. He's a retired psychiatrist and ex-research fellow at Birmingham. He's a medical journalist and author of several books. He's written for The Spectator, The Guardian, and the New Humanist Journal. And he has a keen interest in history, in the history and origins of religions. Alex O'Connor, to my right, is an Oxford University student here with us. He's got an extremely popular YouTube channel on which he discusses politics, philosophy, science, and religion. To my far left is Mohammed Hijab. He's an academic researcher at SOAS in London, and he's also studied in multiple Islamic institutions. I see Mohammed as a kind of public debater. He roams around London, locking horns with Jews, Muslims, Christians, and atheists alike, and as I'm sure you'll all attest if you've seen his YouTube channel, those are most productive conversations that he's had. Abdullah Al-Andalusi is an international activist for Islam and Muslim affairs. He's given extensive talks and written articles rationally critiquing secularism, liberalism, secular democracy, and materialism. He's also the co-founder of the public discussion forum, the Muslim Debate Initiative, that promotes open dialogue and critical thought. And without further ado, I'll ask one of the proposition to step up, supporting the motion, Islam explains reality better than atheism.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
In the name of God, the gracious, the merciful, I'd like to thank the Oxford Forum and my fellow panelists for facilitating this debate and everyone here for attending. I used to be Christian. My mother was Catholic and my father was secular. I went to a Church of England school and learned the basics of Christian belief. However, with there being so many belief systems, I asked myself a question. How did I know I was born into the correct one? Would I have been something different if I was born and raised elsewhere? I then studied every belief, claim, or worldview I could find to discover the ultimate explanation for all things. In doing so, I found that many explanations couldn't account for many things that I could observe or prove themselves false or fell apart due to their own self-contradictions or contradictions between what they say and reality. For example, I encountered Trinitarian Christianity, which argues that God is both one and three, and that the infinite, immortal God is also a finite, mortal man. I encountered polytheists who argued that there are many gods, some eternal, some who popped out of nothing, who are all infinite but have created and finite human or animal forms, suffer ignorance, tiredness, and even injury. Some Pacific Island religions consider volcanoes who created their island and whose sediments make the ground highly fertile for cultivation to be also eternal and divine. I've also found that many atheistic positions are not any more special or more coherent than these. For example, many materialistic worldviews argue that the universe which we see, which is finite, limited, and changing, is also somehow infinite and eternal at the same time. You just can't see it. Other atheist positions argue that the universe ultimately popped out of nothing, albeit with precisely measured amounts of energy, but no cause to determine that measure. Of course, there are also atheistic worldviews like types of Buddhism, which goes to show that atheism doesn't preclude spirituality, just God. When I encountered Islam, I found something different. That Islam describes God as a being of infinite or inexhaustible power and who possesses intentionality or will. He has no human or animal attributes, forms, natures, or appetites. Islam teaches that God is genderless, does not experience tiredness or ignorance, and exists without peer. Surah Ikhlas of the Quran makes clear, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Qul huwa Allahu ahad. Say God is one, Allahu samad. The self-sufficient, lam yalid wa lam yulad. He does not reproduce, nor was he reproduced. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٌ. There is nothing like him, which means he is without partner, because if there were other infinite gods, they would all limit each other and all would not be infinite or gods at all. This is the Islamic concept of God, a pure indivisible oneness, a cause and initiator for all things, a divine unity behind the multitude of created things. And it is the only explanation that is without contradictions and circular reasoning and does not need to appeal to any mystery to hide faults it simply doesn't have. Islam's message to mankind is to avoid the error of mixing the infinite and the finite together and creating false idols by attributing to limited and finite things the attributes that belong only to the Creator and vice versa. Instead, Islam asks mankind to recognize the infinite alone as the ultimate creator of all things, who is separate from his creation and not like it. Is this a God peculiar to Islam? No. Anyone on earth today or in history who worships an infinite, unlimited creator who willed all things into existence and does not resemble any finite things or creatures worships the same God we do, whatever religion they call themselves. Islam teaches that it is not something new, but merely a reiteration of the same message that has been repeatedly sent down to mankind throughout different times and places, producing commonalities in many religions throughout history. Now to the title of the debate, Islam explains reality better than atheism. Some might say, well, atheism doesn't seek to explain anything. It's only a lack of belief of God or a rejection thereof. But atheism's denial of the existence of God carries the minimum corollary, that reality is completely explainable without God. And they'd be wrong in my estimation. There are 4 aspects of reality that only Islam's concept of God can ultimately and soundly explain, while atheism cannot do so without falling into self-contradiction. And these aspects are change, matter, finitude, and specificity. Atheism rejects the only sound explanation for change. If this moment depended on an infinite number of previous moments and movements, we'd never exist or get here. If I were to say that my opponents can begin their speech after an infinite amount of time, they would never have the chance to start their speeches, as an infinite amount of time can't end or even begin if you think about it. Likewise, if I asked a poor student, not pointing to anyone in particular, for £1 and he didn't have it, and he asked another who was equally poor, and so on, I'd never get that £1 until the chain of students found at least one student who had £1 to begin the chain of lending and eventually get to me. Now, this is known as the infinite regress fallacy, which is the same as asserting a beginning and no beginning at the same time. It is a contradiction and therefore impossible. The existence of change and movement requires a first mover. There's no way around that. And if it is the first mover, it means it chose to move things without being moved by anything else. Therefore, it has a will. This is the key characteristic of God, whose name is Al-Mubdi, in the initiator in the Quran. 2, atheism rejects the only sound explanation for the ultimate basis behind matter. If matter gets its attributes and characteristics because it is made from something more fundamental than it, let's just say subatomic particles and forces, ultimately quarks and bosons, and these things are made of, let's say, quantum vacuum energy or fluctuations in such thing, or superstrings, one or the other for the sake of argument, what is quantum vacuum energy, or what are superstrings, if they even exist, made of? If something else, and that's made of something else, where does it stop? If it has no end, then nothing would exist. It's like saying a branch is held aloft from the ground by an infinitely tall tree, or a pond has no bottom to hold up the water, despite the water being at a specific level. The fact that anything exists and continues to exist proves there must be something fundamental that is supporting all these things, that itself isn't made of anything else and has no parts, and therefore is self-sustaining. The Quran calls God Ar-Razzaq, the sustainer, Al-Hafidh, the preserver, Al-Samad, the self-sufficient. 3, atheism rejects the only sound explanation for finite things. If something has size, shape, charge, or a specific characteristic, what determined these limitations in the first place? If it were determined by a finite thing outside itself, an efficient cause, going on forever, it's an infinite regress fallacy. If it was determined by the building blocks inside itself, a material cause going on forever into smaller and smaller blocks, it's another infinite regress fallacy. The only possibility left is that all forms and limited characteristics of all finite things were ultimately created by something that has no finite limitations itself, i.e. something infinite, which has no limits that need determining by something else, and therefore is the ultimate or necessary thing, and it creates all other things. The Quran calls God Al-Khaliq, the creator. 4. Atheism rejects the only sound explanation for the specificity of finite things. Things in the universe, including the magnitude of the forces of gravity, strong, weak force, and electromagnetism, and the amount of energy contained in the universe, are specific to a certain magnitude, size, quantity, and quality. Considering that the universe could have one quark more than it has, the question is, what determined it would be one way and not another? Perhaps the conditions prior to the universe's emergence, shall we say, led to the conditions we see now. But this only shifts the burden of explanation further along the chain. What then determined the precise pre-existing conditions before the universe that led to our universe being the way it is? If we invoke an infinite chain of pre-existing conditions to explain our current condition or the condition of the emergence of the universe, this is yet again another infinite regress fallacy, I'm afraid. The only remaining explanation is that something ultimately chose or determined by its will all things to be the way they are. The Quran calls God Al-Musawwir, the shaper. Islam posits that God ultimately created and sustained all things. He is infinite, unlimited, and self-sustaining, and He alone measured out the numbers of things and apportioned all the regularities, or what you call natural laws, behind all things. It is the Islamic concept of God that not only explains reality better than atheism, but it is the only explanation ultimately that can explain reality that we see, which does not possess self-contradictions, circular logics, or appeals to mystery or blind faith. The arguments of atheists, in my experience, are no different to those I've encountered from polytheists, Trinitarians, or volcano worshippers. Atheists just call their God the universe, which essentially is just a bigger volcano. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdullah. Can I have someone from side opposition to go and speak? Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to the Oxford Forum for making this happen. I did have some things to say in preparation, but one thing that we have to understand before we can even begin this discussion is the concept of the burden of proof. I did have some things to say, like I mentioned, but I think I'd rather just tackle some of the misrepresentations that I think we've just seen of the position of atheism. The first is a rather important case, which is, do we actually have anything to prove as non-believers in God? Atheism, as Abdullah quite rightly suggests, is thought of by many as simply a lack of belief in God. And the point was raised that no, that can't be the case, because a lack of belief in God entails some belief in the opposite, or at least a belief in a universe that can be explained without God. This isn't the case. Atheism is a claim to belief. It comes from the Greek, a meaning without, theos meaning God. It simply means living your life without the influence of a God. It's not an active position to hold. Many people would call it agnosticism, because we're simply saying, well, there's no good reason to believe in a God, but we're not saying that we believe there isn't one. But agnosticism is a claim to knowledge. Gnosticism is knowledge. Theism is belief. I simply say, I don't know, therefore I don't believe. Whereas the proposition seem to have to say that they also don't know, because nobody can know for certain, and yet they do believe. And what we need to see tonight, in order to agree with the proposition and have them win the debate, is the reason why they're able to take that extra step that we simply can't. So let me explain with an analogy that comes from a friend of mine called Matt Delahunty, who has given the example of a gumball, a jar of gumballs. What's essentially happening here is we've got a jar of gumballs, and we have no idea how many gumballs are in the jar. And the people to my right are pointing it and saying there are an even number of gumballs in that jar. And I say, you have no good reason to believe that. I don't believe you. And they say, oh, so that entails that you think there's an odd number. Well, of course it doesn't. It just means I don't believe that there's an even number. Just because I don't believe that there's a God doesn't mean I do believe that there's not one. And that's an important point to make clear, because it demonstrates the fact that the burden of proof lies with the proposition. If you, ladies and gentlemen, are not convinced by either side in the debate this evening, then the default position has to be atheism. The default position has to be there's no good reason to believe either way, and so we simply don't believe in Islam. That's why the title of the debate is something of a false dichotomy. But the burden of proof certainly lies with the proposition. But that's not a problem, because there were a number of arguments put forward in an attempt to try and fulfill that proof, which it's worth briefly touching on. For instance, when you bring up the point, Abdullah, about matter, you ask the question, what are superstrings made of? Talking about, I presume, the kind of quantum strings that are thought to be, according to string theory, at the basis of the universe. And you say, essentially, well, what are these made of? And what would that be made of? And what would that be made of? Well, the answer is quite simple. It's, I don't know, and neither do you. And that's the point. Neither of us know. And so I'm simply saying that because we have no reason to know what's at the basis of this reality, what's at the basis of matter, the best thing we can do is throw up our hands and say, until good evidence comes along to believe that it is due to some kind of divine supernatural creator, let's not do so. And certainly, let's not instill that supernatural creator with certain qualities that are an extra leap of faith that you can't take that extra step before you've made the first. Also, on the point of change, you talk about infinite regress, which is problematic. Of course, the problem of everything needing a cause, everything needing an explanation for its existence, whether you frame it as a contingency argument or a cosmological argument, of course, trivially applies to the creator himself, or of course the creator, of course, unless you adopt something of a Kalam cosmological argument that says that, well, we're not talking about everything needing a cause, because, of course, like I say, it would trivially include the creator of the universe. Instead, it's things that begin to exist that need a cause. It's things that have some kind of that have some kind of cause that brings them into existence. The fact of the matter is we have no experience with that. You say that there are atheists who believe that things can come out of nothing. There's no good reason to think that something can't come out of nothing. People often say it's ridiculous to suggest that something can come from nothing. You're not all worried that a hippo has just materialized in your living room while you're out here. But your living room isn't nothing. In fact, there's no nothing in the universe. Lawrence Krauss has shown that if you take away, or written that if you take away every piece of matter from a finite space, and you remove not just the matter, but the radiation and everything that we can conceivably call matter, it still weighs something. Now, that might be a practical limitation. Perhaps there is nothing somewhere, and we just haven't been able to access it or create it by removing the sufficient matter in the universe. But the fact of the matter is we have no experience with nothing, and so to say something can't come from nothing is an unjustifiable claim. We've never had any nothing to try it with. In fact, the only time there was nothing, if there was nothing ever at all, must have been before the universe was created. And so the only thing that has actually begun to exist in any meaningful sense is the universe itself. And if the argument is that everything that begins to exist has some kind of cause, and so the universe must have some kind of cause, well, everything that begins to exist is the universe. So when you say everything that begins to exist needs a cause, you're just saying the universe needs a cause. And the conclusion is, of course, that the universe has a cause. And that's the definition of a circular argument. Now, that's the first point. The second thing I'd like to do, I'm not sure how long I've been up here now. I haven't got a good track on time. How long? 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Okay, so about halfway through. So let me put to you some of the things that I was thinking of putting forward. Did I not have anything to respond to in the propositions case? I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of discussion of metaphysics this evening. There's going to be a lot of discussion of arguments for the existence of God, the existential arguments, let's call them. And so I wanted to take a brief moment to bring up what might seem like an irrelevancy, but is certainly not. Islam teaches that there is an objective basis to morality in the world. That when you say something is right or wrong, that is a true statement, and that's as true as something like the proposition that the earth orbits the sun. It is a matter of fact. And that means that part of the reality that we're trying to describe with the Islamic worldview is moral realism. There have to be moral truths that are as real as the metaphysical claims that it's making. And what that means, ladies and gentlemen, is that if you find moral claims within the doctrines of Islam that you don't agree with, then you don't agree with Islam. So I want to consider some of the moral elements of this religion and see if it's something that you would be able to throw your weight behind. There are, of course, many examples that I could choose from, but one of the most important areas and one of the most often spoken about areas is the treatment of women. Now, this is problematic because a lot of the time people will point to practical examples. They'll say, look at Saudi Arabia. Women weren't able to drive until very recently, but this is ridiculous. Saudi Arabia can quite easily be shown to not be a real Islamic state, and it's very easy to make a case that that's the state and not the religion. So let's turn to the doctrine itself. Let's turn to the scripture. What do we find? Well, there's a very famous verse in the Quran, and I'm sure this is nothing that the proposition hasn't come up against before, but I'd like to hear some kind of justification for these things, and I'm sure they'll be able to provide them. In the Quran, Surah 4, verse 34, I'm sure you're familiar with, is the verse which I'll quote to you. Men are in charge of women by right of what Allah has given one over the other, and what they spend for maintenance from their wealth. So righteous are women who are devoutly obedient, guarding in their husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them. But if they obey you, seek no means against them. Indeed, Allah is ever exalted and grand. So what we have is a situation where if a wife is disobedient, of course first you try to talk them out of it. Second, you stop having sex with them. But that really doesn't work. But then you strike them. Now, okay. Perhaps this isn't a thing about women. Perhaps this is just a thing about violent behavior. It's just about striking people who are disobedient, and not even disobedient to the husband, but disobedient to God. If someone's being disobedient to God, then they need to be set right. And perhaps the only way to do that sometimes is with physical violence. Well, okay, if that's the case, then let's look at a comparison from a hadith reported by Al-Hakim on disobedient men. So this is in reference to wives talking about their husbands. She should not beat him in case she is stronger than he. If he is more in the wrong than she should plead with him until he is reconciled. If he accepts her pleading, all well and good, and her plea will be accepted by Allah. While if he is not reconciled with her, her plea will have reached Allah in any case. So if a woman is disobedient to a man or disobedient to a god, whichever framework you want to think about it, the first thing that the wife should do, if the man is disobedient, is to try and talk him out of it. And if that doesn't work, it's not a problem, because Allah's going to hear it anyway. But if a wife's disobedient to a husband, then sure, he should still try and talk her out of it. But if that doesn't work, well, then you can strike them. Seems to be a bit of an inequality here. And that inequality is only highlighted when we look at the rest of that same hadith. It's preceded by the following. It is not lawful for a woman who believes Allah to allow anyone. It is not lawful for a woman who believes in Allah to allow anyone in her husband's house while he dislikes it. Okay, well, back in the times that this book was written, men were primarily the owners of wealth, so it makes sense if the man is the owner of the property, perhaps it should be his decision who's allowed on the property. That's not so much a problem. But let's continue. She should not go out of the house if he dislikes it, and should not obey anyone who contradicts his orders. It's getting a bit more questionable now. And to finish off, the very next sentence is, she should not refuse to share his bed. And you can take that to mean what you will. But I'll remind you that if you find any of this objectionable, then you should find objectionable the doctrines from which they spring. Another thing I'd like to talk about, and I'm certain, because I've certainly seen Mr. Hijab respond to this in the past, and it's something I'd love to dive into, is the marriage of the Prophet to Aisha, as certainly the Muslim members of our audience this evening will be aware of, but perhaps not everybody. Muhammad, while in his 50s, married a young girl called Aisha, and I say young, she was 6 at the time. Not 16 or 60, but 6. Now, of course, he didn't consummate the marriage when she was 6 years old. That would be quite outrageous. He waited another 3 years until she was 9. And the proposition has to defend the idea that that was ever morally permissible. And I think that's my time. Is that my time?
Yes.
Well, that's all I've got, but believe me, I have more. So we'll leave it for the rebuttal stage. But thank you.
If the next speaker on proposition, Mohammed, thank you.
I want to thank everyone for coming today. Thank you very much for coming. It's first day of Ramadan for us, and we're happy to have you. Now, I've come here, me and Abdullah, actually, we've come here to refute magic. Wait a minute, what did you say? Let me say that one more time. We've come here to refute magic. It's actually an interesting magic trick where there is no bunny, there's no hat, and in fact, there's no magician at all. It's the proposition that something can come from nothing. Not only from nothing, ladies and gentlemen, but from nothing and by nothing. The Quran says, أَمْ خُلِقُوا مِنْ غَيْرِ شَيْءٍ أَمْ هُمُ الْخَالِقُونَ أَمْ خَلَقُوا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ بَلْ لَا يُوقِنُونَ. Were they created from nothing? Or were they themselves the creators of themselves? Now we've heard Alex today, for the second time I've heard him say this, he says that the universe may have come into existence from nothing. Minute 14 to 15 in his video, Does the Universe Have a Cause? He says, when the universe came into existence, it well and truly came into existence from nothing. Now, wait a minute. Ladies and gentlemen, I have a challenge. That's an active claim. He said, I'm not here to make any active claims. Sorry, that is an active claim. Look at the syntax of that particular sentence. You're saying the universe came into existence from nothing. Don't pretend to be passive. Oh, I don't know. No, you do know. You're making a statement. Either you know what you're saying or you don't. Tell me how the universe came into existence from nothing and by nothing, ex nihilo. I want to know. Tell me how that's possible metaphysically, ontologically, cosmologically, from first principles. Give me the answer, please. But it's interesting because in his other video, Something from Nothing, where he was debating the contingency argument with a fellow American, or an American man, minute 48, he says this, listen to this. He agrees with the radio guy that was speaking to him that the universe is a necessary existence. Wait a minute. What's going on here, ladies and gentlemen? What does necessary existence mean? A necessary fact is a fact that cannot be any other way. 2 + 2 = 4. That's eternally going to be the case. So a necessary existence is eternal. It cannot be any other way. So wait a minute, if the universe is eternal, how could it come from nothing? Contradiction. It's a contradiction. You can't have it both ways, my friend. And this is what atheism leads you to. Contradictory set of propositions. Either you have your cake or you want to eat it, what are you going to do with it? Tell me now, did the universe come from nothing? If so, how so? That's an active claim. Is the universe a necessary existence? If so, how so? That is an active claim. Is it eternal? Just, come on, please. Don't pretend to be innocent and agnostic. Number 2. You could say, no, there's a multiverse, or there's an eternal fabric, or there's an eternal universe. But a multiverse has the propensity of being any other way. And, I'm sure you study philosophy, you know what you're talking about. A possible existence, or a contingent existence, is defined by being able to be rearranged in any other way. If it can be arranged in another way, it's not necessary. It's possible or contingent. It's not necessary. So a multiverse cannot be necessary existence because it can be arranged in another way. It can be out of existence. So wait a minute. This is very important, guys. Hold on. You agree that there should and ought to be a necessary existence. If you agree with me on that, then you're not an atheist. Because the necessary existence is the Islamic definition of God. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Say He is one and only. The self-sufficient, the independent. Meaning, the necessary existence. لَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ. He begets not, nor is He begotten. Meaning He's eternal. If you say that there's a necessary existence, you cannot say you're an atheist. From an Islamic perspective. And from a philosophical one. Moreover, we have to ask a question now. We're talking about Islam. So, why is Islam any different from any other religion? Because Islam talks about one necessary existence, one independent, one self-sufficient. Not 3 in 1, 1 in 3. Not a triune God. Not a multiplicity of gods, a plethora of gods. Not a pantheism. And by the way, I have to make this clear now. It was a bit of a straw man argument because Alex came up and says that Abdullah said that the universe has a cause. He never said that in the statement. But he had these written things. We never use the word cause. You can have a necessary existence. You can make an ontological argument for a necessary existence without causation at all. There's a difference between possibility and contingency on the one hand, or necessity and causation. You don't even need to, you can have it. You don't believe in causation before the universe? Fallacy of composition? Have it, no problem. You have to explain how there can be a world with only possible existences. How can there be a world with only possible existences? If you say there can't be, and we're happy to say there's a necessary existence, you're no longer an atheist from an Islamic perspective. Because you believe in an independent, self-sufficient thing that everything depends upon. And that is the ultimate explanation for all of existence. Now, a secondary point we need to make is that Islam, the concept of God, the Tawheed, the monotheism, is something not only intuitive, but it's something, as we've seen, that can be reasoned from first principles, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why, already when we just look at the concept of God, so many of the major world religions are ruled out. Christianity is ruled out. Hinduism is ruled out. I would say Sikhism is ruled out. Why? Because of that pure monotheism, that respectable monotheism that Islam has to offer. But in addition to that, as Abdullah alluded to, the meta-narrative of there being many prophets aforetime, many of them with the same message of Islamic monotheism, believing in one God and worshipping one God, is something which can be seen in the religious books. What Abraham said, what Moses said, what did they come and say? Even according to Old Testament literature, calling the people to monotheism. So, Islam also has an inbuilt system of falsification. It works in a similar way to science in many ways. 4 challenges, which I'm happy to take questions on the questions and answer, or in the cross-examination. 1, if this book was from other than God, the Quran says about itself, there would have been many contradictions, chapter 4, verse 92. Number 2, the inimitability challenge. Try and produce something like it. And there is a quantifiable way of doing so, which we can talk about in the question and answers. Number 3, that Islam makes predictions about the future. And it specifies time and place. And this is my claim. It's the only religion to make a series of predictions about the future, none of which have not materialized. Whereas with anyone you want to mention who makes predictions of the future, at least some of their predictions will be falsified. And I'm willing to be tested on this. Test it. It's falsifiable. And in fact, this falsifiability is even stronger than the scientific one. Why? Because in scientific falsifiability, everything is susceptible to falsifiability. Everything that's done now, if I do a scientific experiment, now it can be falsified. But with a retrospective perspective, a hindsight perspective, if predictions have been made of the future, we can see whether those predictions are right or wrong. And we can talk about those predictions there's a book coming out called The Forbidden Prophecies by our era. That's going to be something which details that case in detail. Now the interesting thing is you have a nihilist, someone who does not believe in existential, he's an existential nihilist who's cosmic skeptic. He's an existential nihilist, a moral nihilist. He is an epistemological nihilist. He doesn't even believe in morality. And he's making a moral case today. I mean, I don't know how this works. I really don't know. He says, I subjectively value my liberty. In one of his videos, The Moral Argument, 1 hour and 16 minutes. Tell me how, from first principles, liberty works. Is it not based and predicated on a fictitious, hypothetical, mythological state of nature detailed by John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and those individuals? Where's the scientific evidence for that? Why do you believe that? Why do you believe in equality? John Locke established his equality on the hedonistic principle and on a theory of God. Now you're an atheist, try and find from first principles why you believe in equality. We as Muslims don't believe in second wave feminism. Simple as that. Yeah, there's some things in Islam which are different for men than to women. Why do I have to justify myself to you? You have to justify why that equality of that Eurocentric understanding of equality of second wave feminism in the 60s that emerged is the objective morality. That's you, that's an active claim that you've made. You have to substantiate it. But listen to what he says in his video, My Problem with Sam Harris's Morality. Can I finish off?
Yeah, you got a minute left.
If you go to Somalia and tell those women, why do you put those women in bags? They will accuse you of cultural imperialism. So why are you asking the women if they're put in bags? What kind of discussion is that? What kind of sanctimonious Orientalist understanding of morality is that? You have to first prove your morality. You're a subjective moralist. You don't believe in objective morality. Don't ask me about morality. You don't believe in it. Prove it. That's an active claim. And with that, guys, I want to say one last thing, which is that he made an egregious claim in one of his videos called The Liberal Hypocrisy on Islam. He said Islam is a racist religion. And I will tell you that Islam is the only religion ancient religion in the world which completely negates racism. Look at chapter 49, verse 13 of the Quran. Look at the Prophet. He said there's no virtue of a black man over a white man, an Arab or a non-Arab. Now, he's got 3 options. Option 1, to retract the statement. Option 2, Yes, option 2, to provide the evidence, or option 3, face public humiliation today. And there's no fourth option. So don't make claims about morality and about Islam if you haven't even read the Islamic literature and you don't know what is in its contents. Sorry for I know it's quite a, performance, but it's it's a passionate topic for us. I'm thanking everyone here, and I also thank Cosmic Skeptic for coming and for once speaking to the Muslim community rather than about them. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that, Mohammed. Now can we hear from Colin Brewer?
I'm a bit of an amateur at this. These guys are all more or less professional. I wish I was as certain of anything as the people on this side of the table seem to be of absolutely everything. And I want to start by not singling out Islam particularly, because Islam is just one of those monotheisms that seems to find atheism terribly worrying. I mean, whether the theistic religions believe in one god or many gods, they're terrified of people who don't believe in any gods. And when they have the power to do so, and in the case of Christianity, when they had the power to do so, they routinely try to silence people like me at best by censorship, at worst by imprisonment, exile, or execution. And there's nothing particularly Islamic about this. Christianity was executing people just for being the wrong sort of Christian before Islam was a twinkle in Muhammad's eye. And they continued to do so until 1826, which was when the Spanish Inquisition executed its last victim. Here I want to quote you a couple of worried Christians talking about atheism in the 17th century. One of them was both French theologians. One of them said, "I am afraid that atheist writings will disclose thoughts to me that would throw me into a fear from which I would not be able to return." And his contemporary, André d'Abillon, said that for such skeptics there is no punishment violent enough for so dark a crime. Even in our own relatively tolerant country, when Parliament was open to people who were not members of the Church of England, guess who came last? First of all, they let the Catholics in, about 1829. They let the Jews in about 1850. They let atheists in about 1880. So Christianity no longer has any power to liquidate people who question it, and almost everybody in Britain and most civilized countries is pleased about that. I'll explain what I mean by civilized in a moment. Islam has not lost that power. Not only that, but many people in Islamic countries, and in some Islamic countries, most of the people are very pleased that it has the power to do very nasty things to atheists. The Islamic countries were the only ones who refused to sign the part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 that said that deals with freedom of religious belief, including the freedom to change your religion or not to have one. And that's why I think that such countries are, in one very important sense, not totally, not altogether civilized. Last year, I was asked by a professor of English at the university in one of the more liberal Arab countries if I would write an article for his small Arab language departmental journal on Sigmund Freud's use of language. It will be published soon. I'm very proud of it. It'll be my first work to be published in Arabic. But it has one very important omission. Soon after I started writing it, I thought I'd better check with him whether it was okay to mention that Freud was an atheist. He said, "If you do that, they will immediately close down the journal and possibly my department as well." Now, you don't really persuade me that you get a better grip on reality when you spend your time trying to stop people from giving their views on various aspects of reality. And when you outlaw discussion about what reality might mean. And whatever we mean by reality, I suggest there are two broad types of reality. One is historical reality, which means an attempt to find out what really went on in the past. And the other sort of reality is current reality, things that we can examine, question now. So let's deal with historical ones first. A few years ago, I was on holiday in Morocco, and we hired a driver to take us around, and it was quite a long drive. He'd been to university in Britain. His English was excellent, and naturally enough, the discussion turned to Islam, and he was very keen to tell us his thoughts. And I learned from him that it is completely wrong that Jesus was the Son of God and that he died on the cross. Now, these are the fundamental tenets of Christianity. They don't get any more fundamental than that. And he said that probably, and there's a certain amount of debate about this among Islamic scholars, that it may have been actually Judas, suitably disguised, who died on the cross. Now, not being a theist, I don't particularly care which of them is right. They cannot both be right. Either Jesus died on the cross or he did not die on the cross, and either he was Jesus or he was Judas. But they cannot both be right. They can, however, both be wrong. And that is the problem when you start insisting that things written in ancient documents must be believed without any question. There is actually a lot of questioning to be done about the origins of the Quran. There is very little documentary evidence for about 200 years. Christianity is bad enough because there is nothing about Christianity that dates from earlier than about 40 to 60 years after the crucifixion. And we know how difficult it is to be certain about events that happened 20, 30 years ago. People have ferocious arguments about the Second World War, about all the various other wars that have happened since. So when you're making claims with the kind of certainty we have seen from this side of the table about historical events, when even the history of the Quran is shrouded in quite a lot of mystery, and when you threaten people with serious sanctions if they try and do research on it, that, to me, does not say very much about your desire to get to grips with reality. It was not permitted to do serious historical research on the Bible until about the end of the 18th century. You could still be sent to prison in Britain for denying the Trinity as late as about 1812. But eventually in the 19th century, serious higher criticism, as it was called, of the Bible appeared. And now people are very much less certain that everything said in the Old and New Testaments is actually true in every respect, to put it mildly. The Catholic Church didn't allow that until about 1941, and Islam does not allow it still. Islamic scholars have found their careers seriously threatened if they really tried to get to grips with some of the mysteries of the early versions of the Quran and so forth. So let's turn now to, how am I doing for time? About halfway? Sorry? Oh, you didn't, that's right, all right. I didn't hear the halfway mark. Let's turn very quickly then to reality as is current. A few years ago I got into some discussion with Dr. Majid Katme, who describes himself as the spokesman for the Islamic Medical Association of the United Kingdom on medical ethics. And I was interested about Islam's line on abortion. And he wrote to me saying, because obviously one of the issues in abortion is when does the fetus become human? When does the fetus gain the kind of status where its destruction becomes increasingly important? And he said, I'm quoting him directly, at 6 to 7 weeks of pregnancy, the soul is breathed in the body of the fetus. Divine human life starts when the embryo turns into a fetus. Okay, so that's relatively clear. It's not a human being until it turns into a fetus. At this critical stage, it's absolutely forbidden to interfere with this new sacred life. One can call the fetus here a persona, human and divine. However, there's wide Muslim opinion in the Muslim world, considered by many Muslim scholars in the past. And some of them say that ensoulment occurs 120 days after conception. Personally, I and other Muslims do not agree with this view, based on a wrong Arabic interpretation of one saying of the Prophet. And then he said, this important saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when 42 nights have passed over the nutfa, the fertilized egg, Allah sends an angel to it, who shapes it and makes its hearing, vision, skin, flesh and bones. And then he says, O Lord, is it male or female? And your Lord decides what he wishes, and the angel records it. He gives the reference in the hadith. So there it is. Forget all that ludicrous stuff about Y chromosomes and gender. It's Allah what does it. Maybe someone should ask the Muslim Council of Great Britain if they really want someone like that advising them on medical matters. Yes, I will finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Colin. Is there any argument on this side that you particularly want to address from these two gentlemen on my right?
Yeah, well, I'll just go with the conversation myself then, and we'll start off.
Yeah.
So basically, I think maybe my colleague is used to debating perhaps some certain Christians and what have you. I like to think that perhaps we're a slightly different breed in terms of our approach or philosophical approach. I don't think he addressed actually what I said, and I think strawman my argument. For example, I'll give you an example. So I never said everything that begins to exist has a cause. I never used that because you could always say, well, how do you know everything does begin to exist? And that would require empirical verification, which is that's why I never said it in the first place. I merely posited that ultimately, and I don't know where this ultimately is, I just said ultimately there will be a cause. I don't know how old the universe is. Maybe we've been through a couple, 6 or 7 big bangs and big crunches until getting to this point. Of course, the universe is everything that exists. I merely said that at some point, it has to start somewhere, because an infinite regress would mean there would be no change, no creation, nothing. And the same for things like what matter is composed of. I never made an assumption that it is quantum vacuum energy or superstrings, which a lot of scientists now doubt the idea of superstring theory, a bit fantastical. But I just posit those two, like say whatever you want. The question can always be asked, what are they made out of? And what are they made out of? If their attributes come from what they're made out of, for example, then what can they be made out of? Until you get to the point where there must be something that's fundamental, a fundamental substratum that supports all reality's existence. And if it's fundamental and it's necessary, then it wouldn't be limited and it would be self-sufficient, because it wouldn't require anything prior to it or underneath it or further more fundamental than itself. So these are the kind of the arguments I made, but I guess just to kind of reframe this discussion in terms of what I mean by atheism, or why I mentioned the term atheism. You're right, atheism isn't a belief, but I posited that it carries a necessary corollary, something attached to it, which is if you don't believe in God's existence, not that you may be just, it's just your default. No, if you don't believe in God's existence, that means that your worldview does not require you to posit God to explain things. And I really posited that reality imposes certain problems if you want to keep God out of that discussion, because ultimately you can't explain cause, matter, specificity, or limited and finite things. And my explanation isn't one where I know stuff because I've observed it, is that God is the only explanation to avoid self-contradictions. And that's pretty much it. Like I'm saying, if we take 2 and we add 2, I know that this will equal 4, because taking the premises, the conclusion must follow. So likewise, I know that the premises are the existence of finite things. That's the premises. So I know that eventually at some point, it must follow that there must be a beginning point, a creating point, a start point, and a fundamental substratum that's supporting all things. Even though I don't know where that is, where the boundary of that is, that's my argument.
Could you put that into deductive form?
Into deductive form, well, I
Yeah, you
thought
say, so 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a deductive form. It's a premise and a conclusion. It's not deductive form to say there is matter and matter must have a beginning. What's the deductive argument there?
Well, for example, it's the avoidance of contradiction,
So
because I just explained. So if I was to say 2 plus 2 equals 6, right, and 6 meaning what we conventionally understand 6 to be, we'd know that was wrong because of contradiction. So my point was that if you were to say, well, before us, or before this point in time, there was an infinite number of moments or movements, I would say we would never reach this point in time because it would be a contradiction.
I know what he's trying to get at.
It's one of the longest questions I've ever been asked. I think you know what I'm saying.
You're trying to say, you want us to say everything that begins to exist has a cause.
No, that's not necessarily the kalam. That's not what I'm going for. All I'm saying is that the reason why you can say that 2 plus 2 equals 6 is false is because you're right, it leads to a logical contradiction. The reason for that is because it's essentially a logically valid argument with premises and conclusions, and you can identify exactly how it contradicts. You can put it into a truth table and show that it's
2 plus
false.
2 equals 4.
Yes.
It's a tautology though. 2 plus 2 equals 4.
Well, precisely. It's a tautology, and you can prove that deductively. But there's no... Can you highlight precisely what the premises are and the conclusions are of your argument here, so you can do it in the same way?
Like that? Because
it does if you're going to say that it leads to contradictions if you don't agree with the conclusion.
Well, it does, because an
need to formalize it.
infinite regress is basically saying that there was no beginning, and yet we're explaining, or there was no cause, and we're explaining the cause of things, or we're explaining the beginning of things, or we're explaining movement. So there was no first movement, but there is movement. So it creates a contradiction in terms, because in essence we rely on a pre-existing state or pre-existing conditions of movement, and yet ultimately you're saying there is no beginning to this pre-existing thing. There's just an eternal chain, that there is no start to it, and therefore it's the same as saying nothing actually
I'm trying to
exists.
get you to prove that we require.
Right, so I've got one statement that can kind of summarize it for you. Anything susceptible to addition or subtraction cannot be infinite. Okay, so it doesn't need to be a deductive 3-stage deduction.
Well, no, that makes it a deductive.
Right, so no, I'm just giving one statement. What he's saying is that if you have an infinite thing and you add to it, then there's the absurdity of adding to an infinite physical quantitative thing. So you'd have to disprove that statement. Now we've made the statement, anything susceptible to addition or subtraction cannot be infinite. So in order for you to prove your infinite regress, if you wanted to prove it, you have to prove, or you have to show how it's demonstrably possible for something to have infinity as a quality, as well as addition and subtraction there as well.
No, I don't.
So then you can't really make any claim.
I don't know, but I'm not making a claim. That's the thing.
So then why are we having this discussion?
Because I'm opposing your claims.
Well, you can't oppose
your
that,
claim
isn't
is
it?
that your claim is that it requires it, and I'm just asking you why that's the case.
I'm saying anything that is
the logical form, the idea that it is logically necessary to have causation, or that there can't
No,
be.
we didn't say anything about causation.
There can't be an infinite regress.
No, I've just said what I've said.
Can we just have a final statement from you and from you?
Yeah.
Can
Just
I have
the
my
statement.
two
Sorry,
minutes?
apologise. The statement I made was that
idea-
anything susceptible to addition or subtraction cannot be quantitatively infinite.
Yes,
you have to. If
according to
you're
laws-
rejecting that, you have to disprove that. How is it physically, mathematically, or otherwise? How is it possible to have a quantifiable infinite which is susceptible to addition or subtraction? That's all you have to do.
It's another issue of burden of proof. It's not on me to prove that.
Well, I've just made the claim.
It's false. It's you to prove that's true, and you failed to do so.
Okay, I'll give you an example,
And if you'll allow me to answer the question,
ahead.
the answer
Can we just
is
leave it after this one?
the answer is that you're right. Like, these things are required.
Okay.
According to laws of logic and physics that are predicated on the existence of the universe. And we're talking about the universe.
Why is
coming
it
into
predicated on the
existence.
existence of the universe?
Because
Can you prove it?
Well, no.
Okay, so why are you
But
making a claim? It's an active claim.
It's a possibility, right?
No, it's an active claim, which is.
And it's
not a possibility.
It's possibly
Do
true.
you know why it's not a
And
possibility?
if it's possibly true,
No, it's not possible true.
why is it not possible?
Because if the universe is a possible existence, then it cannot explain the existence of other possible existences.
If there is a necessary
Did you get that? Do you understand that part?
Yes, and I'm asking you a question in return. If there is a
No,
necessary...
but can you address that first?
This is what I'm trying to do with the question. If there is a necessary being or occurrence, and that entails another...
Which is what you admit.
And that entails another occurrence.
No, it doesn't entail...
and if it does...
No, it doesn't work like that.
If I may just... I think the confusion is... Firstly, I don't think all things require putting into a logical syllogisms. I don't think it's necessary.
They do if you're going to say they're
it does when you're making contrary propositions. A sentence could say that this sentence is false. It creates a contradiction within the sentence without it being a logical syllogism.
Yeah, but again, that is logically false.
I'm merely pointing out that there are ultimately only two possibilities to basically anything that you might observe which is finite, limited, and what have you, which is either it was the result of something more fundamental than it, or something that is prior to it. And if you ask, well, what was prior to it, anything, or what is more fundamental to anything, either it's something that's like itself, as in something finite, limited as well, or something not the case, not finite and not limited. So I'm saying that if we go down the pathway of just constantly insisting on there's a continual chain prior to this existence of finite, limited things, nothing would exist, because that would cause an infinite regress fallacy, and thereby the contradiction is manifest. As opposed to ultimately at some point saying, well, actually, you know what? At some point, I don't know where, but at some point there was a beginning, or there was something that was not finite, whereby it doesn't have limitations, and just to kind of justify to you, limitations requires explanation. Something that doesn't have limitations doesn't require explanation, because there's no limits for it to be, there's nothing to create its limits for it to be explained by something else.
No, it still requires explanation.
Let's leave
because
absolutely.
Okay.
Getting tangled up. Colin, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to make the very old, simple observation that if you say God created it all, the next obvious question, of course, is who created God? And
Colin,
nobody has given a very satisfactory
just one-
opinion. Please let me finish. Let me finish.
Sorry, apologies.
And the second one is, as I say, you are talking the language of certainty. What we have learned in the course of my lifetime is that the origins of the universe have been pushed further and further back in time. It's a fascinating study. I don't pretend to understand more than the average man in the street about it. But to say that we clearly understand the nature of creation seems to me extremely arrogant, and to pretend that you can speak with certainty about something like that, I think is, to put it mildly, not justified.
Well, I think it's a little arrogant to actually dismiss what we actually said, because we never actually claimed that we know every tiny particle in this universe, or how big it is, or where it began. We never actually said that. So it shows that you weren't listening. I'm just saying that you did. I'm just saying that it shows that you weren't listening to what we were saying, and some people might say that's arrogant too. What I'm saying is very simply this: creation or causation, or whatever you want to call it, is to limit something, to define its limitation. Like when you draw a circle, you're drawing a limitation. So limitations require explanation. But if something has no limitation, then there's nothing that requires it to be determined, because it has there's no boundaries that it exists in. It is fundamentally unlimited.
Exactly.
That's why we say it doesn't
you
require
can't just
creation.
posit a necessary being and say it doesn't require any explanation.
No, we're not positing
I didn't say necessary. I said,
but that's the opposite of
unlimited. No, because limitations require explanation, right? Not lack thereof. Right?
And limitation as opposed to what? What's
as
the
opposed
opposition
to not being limited.
And what is something
limitations
that's not limited?
Well,
It's necessary, because if it's not necessary, then it's limited.
What's your definition of necessary? Because you keep using it incorrectly. What's your understanding of necessary existence?
Well, you were talking about contingent things. It's the opposite of that. So something
can you give a
so
definition?
something that cannot have been differently. That cannot
cannot be
have existed,
differently,
for
and there's no
instance,
explanation for it
What,
outside of itself.
Well, I suppose so.
Right,
yes,
right.
but
And
you'd
okay,
have
so can you tell us how there can be a world with no necessary existence?
well, who says you said we're living in a world of possible, or you said that we have to claim that we're living in a world of possible existences.
Do you agree that there could be
Nobody's claimed that.
Do you accept that there is a necessary existence?
I would say that yes.
Then that's God.
But that doesn't have to be God.
Debate over. Thank you very much.
No, that does not have to be God. I'm sorry.
No. That's our understanding of God.
It does not have to be God.
Yeah, for us, a necessary existence is something which is perfect. Couldn't be any other way. Explains everything else. That's our definition of God.
It explains everything else.
Because it's necessary, it couldn't be any other way. All contingent.
It couldn't have been any other way. That's got no explanatory power.
Alex, all contingent things depend upon it. Yes?
Give me an example of a contingent thing.
This cup.
How was it contingent?
Because it could have otherwise not been in existence.
Do you know you're speaking to a determinist?
Pardon?
Do you know you're speaking
Yeah,
to a
okay, so what is determinism?
So
come from?
if
You said in your thing, sorry.
What determined it?
Let me ask you a question. This might seem isolated, but it will make sense.
Go ahead.
If P entails Q,
Go
and
ahead.
P is necessary,
Yes.
is Q necessary?
No.
It's not.
No. No, it's not. It doesn't have to be. If necessary,
Right, so-
hold on. Let me explain why. What we're doing here is we've said that these dependent contingent things,
As you're defining them,
do you accept that this cup could have otherwise not been in existence?
no.
So, okay,
That's what determinism is.
Well, hold on. So you believe in the determinism?
Yes.
And you said in your speech, in your thing, a universe from nothing, you said that determinism comes from the necessary existence.
Are you talking about the contingency debate with
48
Justin
minutes,
Riley?
yes. 48 minutes in, you said that one necessarily leads from the other. In other words, determinism leads from necessary existence. Yes or no?
Sorry, say that again.
You said
Determinism leads...
determinism leads from necessary existence.
Okay, I think we were talking about a different thing when
No. You said this, and I can show it 48 minutes into the video.
Yes, I said that sentence, but I meant a different thing by necessary existence.
So you said the universe was necessary
This
existence.
can't be a semantic point-scoring exercise. I
It's
meant
not.
something different by what you're
No
talking
problem,
about.
but you said this. You said
Definitions matter.
You said determinism comes from the necessary existence.
What did I mean by that? I mean,
Okay,
I
I'll
require
tell
the
you what you
context
meant,
of the
because I
conversation to know
remember
what I was actually meaning
I
by
just
those
listened to
terms.
this 2 days ago. The guy asked you, is the universe, would you agree with Bertrand Russell that the universe just is, yeah? And you replied and said, yeah, the fact that the universe is necessary existence, I would agree with that in the first instance. And then he said, how would that tie in with determinism? You then said, determinism follows from, it's that which follows, determinism follows from the necessary existence.
Right,
Which
I know what you're
do you
talking
remember?
about. I was the person I was debating with, a guy called Cameron Bertuzzi, he
Yes.
was making the case for the contingency argument. And
Right.
he was saying that there are contingent things in the universe, and therefore he was using that to reason that there's a God. And I said that if that were the case,
Yes.
that necessary existence, the
Yes.
determinism would follow from that. I was making
Perfect.
the case.
Okay, so
I didn't
agree
say
with
that
you.
it does exist.
Listen, Alex,
I didn't say that it does exist.
We agree with you on that point. So this is the thing. You agree with us on more points than you think you agree with us on. You believe in a necessary existence, which explains everything else.
No, necessary existence. Be careful.
You said a necessary existence. Are you retracting it?
I said that
Are you retracting it?
the universe, there's not one unified necessary
But
existence from which
you
all
said
stems.
that the universe was a necessary.
The
So are you
universe
retracting that?
The universe follows a necessary causal chain.
Okay, so is there? No, you said. Hold on. You said the universe is a necessary existence, and then you said determinism follows from that. Now I'm saying that.
Okay,
you
how about this?
accept-
If I said that and I meant what you think I meant by
Yes.
that, then yes, I retract it. But I
So
don't
you
think
retract
that,
it.
But I don't think that's
Do
what
you know,
I
I
meant.
think what it is, Alex, is that you.
But
keep,
people can go and look
no,
that up for
Alex, I'll
themselves.
tell you
You're
what-
very good at making arguments against things I used to believe in.
Oh, okay,
But let's
so
talk
you
about
used to
things
believe in
that
it
we'll
because okay, now it's perfect.
Guys, we're not on speaker's corner.
Okay.
No, 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 no,
Turn it
no.
down a bit, right? Argument, counter.
No, it's
Yes.
important, guys,
Right.
because if you're changing your
Can I
argument
have
now,
Fine by
an
me.
answer? Can I have an answer
yeah,
to
you're
my
changing it
question
because
about
now you've
who
been cornered. That's
created
the only
God?
reason why you've changed your argument.
Okay,
Thank you.
I'll do that.
I respond to, so
Who
the,
created God? Colin Brewer's argument.
yeah, well, we have to actually ask the question, why does anything need creation in the first place? Right? It's a more fundamental question, yeah? So, I mean, I could take this club, but sometimes I just take a stone or something and I say, how do you know that this actually thing was created or required creation? So if this thing was, let's say, eternal or let's say uncreated, then why is it in its particular shape, form, and so on and so forth that it didn't choose? If something was uncreated and nothing determined its limitations, then it wouldn't have limitations, which is my point. So therefore, it's kind of ridiculous to argue that God requires creation when he has no limits that require defined by anything to be defined by or determined by something else. And that's why we know that anything is created is only because it has limitations.
How long do you think God's been around for?
Eternity.
Well, okay. What I'll say is that God is outside of time, so there's no pre-existent time before him, right? He's the beginning.
How do you know?
But you know what? I just want to kind of just
You're
pause
making
and
a
rewind something
statement.
that you mentioned in your presentation. I just want to just briefly touch on it before we touch anything else, which is you said that Islam is terrified of people professing atheism, right? Again, I think that I don't know what experience you've had maybe with from reading European history books, but I suppose you should read books about Mesopotamia and Islamic
I quoted the
civilization.
experience
The
of
Prophet
a
Muhammad,
current
if I may just finish, I'll let you respond. So the Prophet Muhammad had a famous debate with a Bedouin atheist, right? There was no intolerance there. The Bedouin atheist actually became Muslim, but there was no intolerance just because the guy initially professed to be atheist. Abu Hanifa, famous classical scholar in medieval Iraq, Baghdad actually, had public open-air debates with atheists. Presumably there's atheists who were living in Baghdad at the time to actually be invited to open-air debates, and no one killed them or was intolerant to them at all whatsoever. And when you say, oh, Islam is terrified of atheists, I just want to say something. You're not special. We encounter polytheists, we encounter Christian Trinitarians, we encounter Zoroastrians throughout our history, and from our perspective, you're all arguing exactly the same thing, which is somehow the finite thing is also infinite and eternal, and we don't really see you as different. Actually, you're just another let's say just not a flavor of ice cream that we are basically encountering. So don't make yourself out to be more special than you are from our perspective. And as for the issue of tolerance of atheists, I think you should question your founders of your very ideology which pervades the West, liberalism. John Locke, in his Letter on Toleration, argued that you should tolerate different Christian sects, Protestants basically, right. But not atheists, because you can't trust what they say. They don't believe in any higher moral value other than maybe what is expedient. Rousseau made also the same argument, and some people say that under the current, you could say, atheistic idea as opposed to the natural rights arguments of John Locke, but the Benthamite arguments of utilitarianism. Really, morality is only based on expediency, and then people's rights are based on whether it's expedient to the state to even tolerate your rights. So now this is not related to the debate itself, but the guy brought it up, and it's really disingenuous to bring up in that kind of debate.
Yes, I mean, are you suggesting that someone like Socrates was a deeply immoral man?
No, I'm not saying it. I'm saying John Locke.
You seem to be implying.
No. John Locke said that you can't trust atheists. He didn't say that they are necessarily by default.
The difference is that the things which our worldview are based upon, which are the philosophies of these men, we can say that those areas of their philosophies were wrong. John Locke said some pretty egregious things.
You're nihilist. How can you say anything?
The difference is, we'll get to that. The difference is.
No, you can't say that you're wrong.
No, I'm not going to grant you that.
You don't believe in objective morality.
The difference is that you can't do the same thing.
No, you can't do it at all.
When there is something immoral,
you don't believe in objective
when there is something immoral in the basis, when there is something immoral that comes from somebody who founded the worldview that we believe in, and something else unrelatedly that he said that no longer applies was wrong.
Can you prove it's immoral?
We can say that we disagree with what he had to say.
Can you prove it's immoral on your worldview?
We can say that we disagree what he had to.
You're making an active claim.
So you can't do the same thing.
You're making an active claim.
When there's immoralities in the Quran, you can't make the same. Look, we have just allowed you to speak, and there were many times I could have interjected and asked you similar questions, and you're making a two-quoque fallacy, and you're smart enough to know it. You can't just turn around and say that you're a hypocrite for being a moral nihilist, especially since I'm not one anymore.
Oh, you've changed your mind now.
Yes.
So you retract that statement as well.
What statement?
The ones that you said you're a moral nihilist.
What do you think moral subjectivism meant to me and means to me? What do you think?
I don't know what it means to you, man. That's a subjective statement.
So you're saying you can't say this because you're a moral subjectivist and a moral nihilist.
Yeah, you're making a moral claim. You're passing moral judgment.
What is moral subjectivism?
Yeah, so you don't have objective morality. It's not fixed. It's not true or false. Despite human thoughts or convictions, that morality is true. So it's only first person subjective.
Let's get a succinct answer to that.
Yeah, my question, can I ask one question, then you can answer it?
Yeah, go.
My question is, he's made it very clear on his public profile that this man does not believe in objective morality. Why and how can you say this in one breath and then passing moral judgments which are based on liberalism? Can you explain how atheism accounts for that, or how it does it?
As I say, that's a two-quoque fallacy.
It's not a two-quoque fallacy.
It is Latin for you as well. It's simply saying, well, you do this too, so who are you to speak? That's not what we're doing here. We are working on your worldview. Your worldview claims that morality is objective, and your worldview has objective moral statements, like the ones I've highlighted. It's your job to prove that those can be coherent with any kind of objective morality.
God is all-knowing. God said so. That's what we believe. Anything God says is all-knowing.
Anything God says is moral.
Yes. Okay, can you refute that, please?
I don't need to. All I need
No, you can't do it. That's why.
I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm trying to talk for the audience. And if the audience find moral precepts within Islam that they disagree with, they have to disagree with Islam.
If you have an all-knowing agency,
as you have said, if God says something is moral, then it is moral as a matter of fact.
That's what we say. Yeah.
And so if the people here this evening disagree with the moral precepts of Islam, they have to disagree with Islam.
Socialization.
Yes. So let's talk about that and let's see if it's really socialization. If there's something more to it than that.
Okay.
You said, if I heard you correctly, anything that God says is moral.
Absolutely.
How do you know what God said?
Well, okay, here, go back to our argument that I said, that we said that We have revelations aforetime. The final revelation is the Quran. It has a falsifiability test. I gave you 4 things: preservation, inimitability, contradictions, and I also taught you about predictions of the Quran and the Sunnah. Now, in order for you to say that the Quran is false, you have to falsify it. Like a scientist would have to falsify a theory in order for them to say that that is wrong. Now, if you can't produce any evidence for that, then really you can only remain agnostic on the issue.
How do you know that the words contained in the Quran were the words that were actually supposed to have been spoken to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel, supposing that any of us in the modern world can actually believe anything like that?
Yeah,
okay, so first and foremost, with regards to morality, it's actually completely irrelevant in this debate concerning when we're discussing explanation of reality. If you don't believe in objective morality, then there's nothing to compare the morality of Islam with.
That's right.
To say that
That's
it is discordant with it.
Yes.
Right? So I think
Yes.
it's a massive red herring, and I think that friend of yours will talk about a few fallacies concerning bringing it up in the first place. You have to first present to us objective morality, and then compare it to Islam's morality and say they don't fit. But you can't, and that's my point. And also the fact that you say, well, if we don't like some morality in the past, or some basis for justifying morality in the past, we can change it. Well, that's what's scary. Because in modern, 21st century Europe, and on 20th century Europe, need I say more, people thought that morality of people's protections of rights and things were no longer convenient for the nation's security, and then they prejudicially persecuted certain minorities because it was no longer beneficial from their estimation. And there's no objective basis to argue against it, other than you say, well, I personally don't like or find it distasteful what they did. So that is actually scary, that you don't have objective morality, because there's no actual promise of rights that you can actually underwrite. As for the, well, no.
I mean, well, yes. I mean, there are. Okay. I mean, you're either asking a question or you're just having another opening statement. Look, the subjectivity of morality doesn't lie at the level of the act itself. It lies at the level of the motivations. I can say to somebody, like I am a psychological hedonist in the same way that Mill was. I can say I know what people's motivations are, ultimately speaking, and there are objective facts to be known about how to achieve a goal. So it's not a case. Moral subjectivism.
Mill didn't say
moral objectivism. Moral. I said I'm a psychological utilitarian, utilitarian like John Stuart Mill, not just a utilitarian.
Okay. Well, I'll
I hope the audience can notice the difference in the level of interjection here. Like I'm trying to really listen to what you have to say, but you've got to let me respond.
Okay, go ahead.
Psychological utilitarianism means that we can know what people's motivations are, and I think we can. There are objective things to be known about how to achieve those goals. If somebody thinks that something's right and I think it's wrong, it's not a case of throw your hands up in the air and say it's everybody's opinion. That's not what moral subjectivism is. That's confusing moral subjectivism with moral relativism. That's not what we're doing.
No, hold on.
And those are not the same thing.
Can we respond?
Go.
All right, so Mill, in chapter 4 of his book on utilitarianism, he actually gave us an exact way of identifying what he called the principle of utility.
Yes.
And through that, he talked about desirability and how when you see that something is desirable for someone, then that is an evidence that it's something which ought to be done.
Okay.
Now, hold on, excuse me.
It's not true.
No, hold on. You can check. I've just given you a reference.
Yeah,
you can check.
The title is not called.
You're interjecting now.
Yes, I am, because the
so,
title is not.
Level of interjection.
The title. I didn't say the audience can notice I'm not interjecting. I said that the audience can notice the disparity in it. Sometimes the interjection is needed, and the interjection here is that the title. The title of that chapter. There is a purpose. There is a reason why the title of that chapter is not the proof of utilitarianism. It is not. The title of that chapter is. The title of that chapter is the kinds of proofs to which utilitarianism is susceptible.
No, hold on. The title of the chapter is Proof of Utilitarianism.
It's not.
You can
check it now. It is the types of proof that utilitarianism is susceptible to.
John Stuart Mill wrote the book himself. You can get the copy from Waterstones now. Everyone in the audience can Google it. Yes, it's actually, the title is Proof of Utilitarianism, chapter 4.
That's what people call it. That's not what Mill wrote.
Who calls it that?
The title, Mill. Mill
what are you saying?
Mill doesn't call it the Proof of Utilitarianism.
That's what it's titled.
He avoids it. He does not
That's
say
the name of the chapter, my friend.
It's not the name of the chapter.
Okay, so should we get it up?
Yeah, if you'd like to.
Okay, if anyone's got utilitarianism, we can see.
Okay,
if anybody has a copy of the book,
let's leave it on that as a reference point.
Okay, yes, my friend.
No, it's important. It's important. The reason why. It's important. The reason why.
Either way.
Guys, come on, because it's sort of descending into chaos. We want to get Abdullah and then we'll get Colin in afterwards.
Okay, so just to continue what I said.
Is he right? It's not proof of. Okay, well, I can see that point. If he's right, I can see
That's
the point.
That's fine, because I don't care if you're right or wrong about that. The thing that matters is the point that he was making, and the point that he was making is that you can't prove utilitarianism because he's a moral nihilist in that sense. But he said that there are certain proofs to which it's
So if you
susceptible.
can't prove it, why make a case?
So because you can't prove that the point that Mill made with the visible thing.
Subjective.
Let me answer the question. The point that Mill made with the
finish
visible thing, which you brought up, is that the only evidence we have that something is visible is that it can be seen. That's what he said. Now, we can't prove
Okay,
that
you can't prove
we
it. Why
can't prove that
why
this
use it?
water is
Okay.
visible, but
Okay,
we both
I'll
agree
do
that
that.
it
One
is.
thing.
And we can use the
One
same
thing.
level
Yeah,
of proof
wait,
to understand moral
Okay,
claims.
just-
It's not a
so
deductive
one
proof,
thing-
it's an inductive.
Why
One
use it
thing-
as an argument?
One thing, for someone who said that there are many things that you don't know in the universe and things that you can't presume.
Yes.
For you to claim that you now know people's motivations with the same kind of certainty enough to make it to derive some objective moral system
Yes.
is somewhat of a contradiction there, because everyone's
Yes.
motivations might be unique or different,
Yes.
or unknowable to you anyway. Certainly, we never understand the viewpoint of a psychopath, of
That's
someone
right.
who has the inability to empathize.
Well, the psychological literature is quite good on that,
Yeah, but look, the study, of course, but to make a claim that basically that you can understand everyone's motivations, or there is some kind of unique template of motivations that all human beings subscribe to or can fit into, is really contradicting what you said earlier on, saying that you don't actually know, or you don't make claims to know things which you don't directly observe.
I make claims
Okay,
about
brief
morality,
response
and I
to
also
that.
didn't say
Brief
that.
response to that from Alex, and
I
then
do-
Colin on the last question, and then we're going to open up to audience questions.
I do make claims about morality. That's not a problem. I never said that I didn't. I also didn't say that I don't make
Where
claims
have you
about.
seen morality? Is it in a
I also
microscope,
didn't
telescope?
say.
Illusion.
I also didn't say that you have to see things to be able to prove them.
Oh, okay. So are they illusionary for you? then?
I would agree with that statement, and I'm
Right.
glad you
Okay,
agree with
let's leave
that.
it there. We're in agreement. Brilliant. Colin, do you want to do the last
yes,
question?
I'm still waiting for an answer to my question of how you can possibly be sure that what are supposed to be the words spoken by God, or rather by the angel Gabriel
Point to that.
to Muhammad, are actually the words spoken, if indeed they were spoken at all.
Okay, brief response to that, and then we're opening up to the audience.
Okay, so a couple of days ago I presented a lecture on how do we know Islam is true when there's so many different, let's say, conflicting or competing belief systems. In essence, from every aspect, from the Islamic concept of God being a main issue, which is what my presentation was trying to focus on, the Islamic concept of God is almost completely unique to Islam, with the possible exceptions of variations of Judaism and philosophers who've reflected upon the possibilities of what could exist and what create all existence, and they've all come to the same conclusion, just like good old the Greek Xenophon, that there must be an ultimate creator who's infinite and he's unlike created things. Xenophon is a famous Greek philosopher who believed that if he rejected polytheism and rejected idols that look like human beings, saying if a cow had a god, it would make the gods to look like cows. So he wasn't an atheist, he just rejected polytheism. And so we would basically kind of side with that view. But
I
the
asked
Islamic
you a very specific question about
Yes.
what the angel Gabriel is supposed to have said to Muhammad. How can you possibly know, how can anybody possibly know that that was actually what happened? How can you know? Explain.
And if I let me just finish my point, which is Islam is basically, when I encountered it and I took it as a hypothesis for how to explain reality, as one possible hypothesis. After looking at different belief systems, including or lack thereof, let's say atheistic positions in belief system, naturalism or materialism, communism and such, I basically found contradictions and things that didn't make sense. And it kind of almost had a process of elimination that Islam was the only one left that actually didn't suffer any internal contradictions, both compared to the observable reality as well as within itself. And that's a very tough thing it's a very tall order to actually achieve if you're not explaining everything, quite literally everything. So, and caveat, not the particularities of things like quarks and bosons, in case you actually say, you're claiming to explain everything. No, but what I noticed is that Islam was the only one left. And then after further investigation, after I thought maybe it could have been a different way, maybe if one particular Islamic doctrine shouldn't exist, or if it was a different way, and I realized that produces contradictions, to the point that I came to the conclusion that Islam was the only possible explanation to explain reality, which is why I was very thrilled to do this debate in the first place. But without going to things like hell's existence and all this other stuff, the main key selling point, you say, of Islam, of the hypothesis of Islam, to explain reality, was its concept of God, which is almost virtually unique to itself, and it's just rationally consistent and coherent.
I didn't ask you about Islam's concept of God. I asked you very specifically about how you can possibly know that the concept of God, whatever it is, that emerges from the Quran can have been dictated to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. I take it, therefore, that you cannot answer that question. Thank you.
Well, it's kind of like the equivalent kind of challenge you're saying. I mean, now we can discuss how do we know the messenger that related the message how do we know from analysis of that it's accurate. But I wanted just to kind of
That's what I'd like to know. That's
know.
what I was asking.
I know. And I wanted to do a kind of a different angle to answer that question, which is what got me into Islam in the first place wasn't
answering a different question.
Let me finish, sir. What got me into Islam in the first place wasn't me looking at the claims or trying to go back in the time machine to find out if the Prophet Muhammad existed or the angel Gabriel came to him. I looked at the message itself and the consistency of the message itself with the universe led me to a conclusion that they both come from the same author. And that's why I became Muslim.
In other words, you can't possibly know. It's just your...
Okay,
We'll leave it to the audience. And see what they have
let's
to
have
say.
some audience questions.
Yeah.
The gentleman in the middle there. Do you want this one, yeah?
Patrick.
Yeah, sure.
The word reality in the proposition is a very big word, and I think it might be productive to focus a little bit away from cosmology for a while and discuss biological reality. Colin raised 1 or 2 points earlier. I was interested that Mr. Hijab used a very interesting, rather provocative phrase. He said, God begets not, nor is begotten. Now that obviously raises hoary chestnuts about biological evolution. I'm going to assume that nobody in this room denies that life forms have evolved over time in our bit of the known universe. The big question is, was there agency behind that? And speaking as a biologist, it's clear to me that one of the driving forces behind what I consider to be the evolutionary principle is faulty copying, which occasionally opportunistically results in benefits to an organism and therefore proliferation of that gene. The big question is, assuming we all accept that life forms have evolved, was there agency behind that? In your case, is the agency delivering faulty copying?
Okay, so there's 2 questions there. Do you agree with the theory of evolution?
Okay. So,
And what was the agency behind it?
do I believe there's agency behind it? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So in essence, as Muslims, we don't dispute what we observe from the universe. The Quran tells us to observe the universe and to understand the how God instituted things, the mechanisms God put in place to bring things about. So that's not a problem, and we have no issue, we have no truck with animal evolution and evolution of obviously microbiotic life and things like this. There's no problem like this and change. But now, for you to claim that the process of copying and mutation that occurs, to claim and call it faulty copying, is actually making an assumption of teleology, of telos, as the Greeks would say, of intention, that life has an intention to create perfect copies, all right? But if a person is a materialist, let's say, that you say that, well, things happen out of necessity, right? Things just occur out of necessity. And what I'm positing, or what we would, let's say, view it as, everything that happens, all the mechanisms in life, as well as in inanimate objects throughout the universe, inanimate matter, let's just say, all these mechanisms have been instituted by God. So there's no problem or contradiction that we have with that at all whatsoever, whatever the case might be, whatever the science reveals.
Okay, so you agree with evolution and the driving force is God?
Can I answer the question?
No, we
Let's
said that
have
all,
one question.
all mechanisms were instituted by God, yes.
Who might,
Let's have 1 question, 1 answer, because otherwise
That's
we're going to go
fine
around in
by me.
circles. Yes, gentleman at the top right.
Okay, so this debate's been about Islam. So this debate's been about Islam and atheism. But I'd like to
Could you speak up a bit, please?
which was that atheists aren't special, and that Muslims have been debating Christians and Jews or Zoroastrians for years. I come from a Muslim and Zoroastrian family. I'm sure there might be Catholics here or Hindus or Jews. The thing is, with Islam and atheism, is Islam makes some claims, and atheism says, we're not making claims. With Islam and Christianity, or Islam and Judaism, Islam is making a claim, Christianity is making a different claim, Judaism is making a different claim. They all evolved at different times. Islam and Christianity and Judaism all make similar claims, but there are significant differences which are of a nature that is very, very important for Muslims, in that for Islam to be true, it has to be able to show that, say, Christian claims about, say, Jesus being the Son of God aren't true. So rather than attempting to argue against atheism, how do you propose to suggest that Islam is right, that the Quran is right, and not the Bible or not the Talmud?
Yeah, so what the gentleman's essentially saying is on this side of the house there are two leaps of faith. The first, God. The second, the Islamic God.
Okay, so we've already shown from first principles how it can be conceived or can be reasoned that a necessary existence, which all other existence depend upon, exists and is in fact necessary for existence. But in terms of the specific claim of Islam, I'll repeat the challenge, and obviously there are people in the audience here. I've said to you before, and I'll say it again, that Islam makes specific claims and challenges which are not found in other texts. And this makes Islam and its texts open to falsifiability. For example, number one is the preservation challenge. Chapter 15, verse 9, it says, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. We have certainly sent down the book and we will certainly preserve it. Chapter 4, verse 92, the contradiction challenge. لَوَجِدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. They would have found in it many contradictions. The third thing is the inimitability challenge. And we said before that this has quantifiable measures. And I'll give you one example. The Quran was a circumstantial revelation, and it was revealed piecemeal, right? So for bit by bit. But despite the fact that the Quran was a circumstantial revelation and it was revealed piecemeal, you'll find that there is an incredible knitted togetherness, a consistency, a coherence of the Quranic text, which make it almost impossible, I would argue, that it would have been from human authorship. For example, the Quran in chapter 3 verse 59 says, إِنَّ مَثَلَ عِيسَى عِنْدَ اللَّهِ كَمَثَلِ آدَمَ خَلَقَهُ مِنْ تُرَابٍ ثُمَّ قَالَ لَهُ كُنْ فَيَكُونَ. That certainly Jesus is like Adam. God created him from dust and said be, and he was. Now notice it says he's like Adam, and if you count the amount of times Adam is mentioned in the Quran, it's 25 times. If you count the amount of times that Jesus mentioned in the Quran, it's also 25 times. Now this is one of, I would say, a plethora of examples, which if you were to churn this into a probability machine, you'll find makes it highly doubtable, improbable, that this could have been done from someone who is being asked questions and answering in the form of revelation. The fourth thing I mentioned was the predictions of the Quran. So for example, the fact that the Quran in chapter 30 verses 1 to 6 predicts that the Roman Empire would beat the Persian Empire from 6 to 9 years, and we have corroborating evidence from this from non-Islamic sources. For example, Theophilus in the 9th century writes this down and so on. Now the thing is, if you find all other, this is my claim is if you look at all other religions, world religions, if there are predictions that are made, I will be able to find you, and this is a challenge I'll put out there for everyone, I'll be able to find you a false prophecy from the major world religions. If someone claims to be a fortune teller, Nostradamus, Charles Russell, from the, whoever it may be, those individuals made a series of predictions, some of which came true, some of which did not. Now what I'm saying is quite bold. I'm saying that the Islamic position is you will not be able to find one thing that the Prophet of Islam or the Quran says will come true that does not come true. And from that we predicate our cosmological understanding that okay, the hereafter, which is something we can't see, just like the future is unseeable, is also going to be actualized, materialized in the same way that everything else has. So we have falsifiability test. This falsifiability test is not in other scriptures, and in order for you to disregard or discard the Quran and the Sunnah, you first have to go through the process, just as a scientist would, of falsifying our claims.
Okay, that's an interesting point. Does anyone on this side want to respond to that? Because it's a good point. There's internal consistency in the Quran, and it's been dictated piecemeal over time. How is it not that there's been a higher order dictating things?
I mean, I'd rather briskly move on to other questions, but I don't think that... I'd say internal consistency is certainly required to say that the Quran is accurate, but it's not sufficient.
Yeah, I said 4 things. That was one.
Yeah.
Okay. I would agree with that, actually. Yeah.
Okay, let's get another question. Does anyone want to ask anything?
I don't think you actually responded properly to that question, which is how can you demonstrate that what is written in the Bible, for example, is not true if what's written in the Quran contradicts it. I gave as an example in my address the Islamic view that it was not Jesus who died on the cross. How can you possibly prove that? How can you know it even if it were so, how can you possibly prove it? How can you claim that anything like that can be known with certainty? And how can you show that the people who reported it in the Bible were wrong?
Can I say for the record, I don't think that's necessary to do, because I have to be very careful with the burden of proof here, which is that the proof needs to lie with the person making the claim, right? The Christians claim that Jesus died and was risen. They need to prove that. The fact that I can't disprove it doesn't mean that I can't have a case against it. I would
Come to the dark
Oh,
side.
no, I mean, I don't think that the Christian claim is necessarily any more credible than the Islamic one. I don't think Christians can prove it either. It's what they believe. But I don't think you could disprove it or give a credible opinion one way or the other. You have a complete lack of evidence.
I mean, what I would say is, certainly in science, there's many hypotheses. And hypotheses, I suppose, is a prediction or a claim based on previous theory, and people like to check out the claims to see if they are consistent with what they can observe. So I never had a problem with actually checking out someone's claims and seeing if there was any proof, and also if it was internally consistent. And my claim against Trinitarian Christians, with all due respect to any Trinitarian Christians here, because they're not represented on this panel, of course, is that I believe that it has internal contradiction between an infinite, immortal God and a finite mortal man who is also God at the same time, as well as belief in God is one and three at the same time. The crucifixion is really inconsequential to that matter, because it's just a historical happenstance, or a claim of a happenstance. But I suppose really, and just to kind of answer that person's point in another angle, and very, very briefly, if I may be permitted, is upon the discussion of is there a burden of proof? There's a burden of proof on us, there's a burden of proof on them, and they're not making any claims, so isn't the burden of proof meant to be only on us? I would say that everyone here has a burden of explanation, an explanation of reality, at least ultimately, right? And the whole point about science is to try to seek to chip away at reality to uncover a local explanation for things, but we're talking about an ultimate explanation of things, and I'm going to make a very strong claim, which is that the idea of an infinite thing which has will, that can initiate by choice, is the only possible ultimate explanation for all things that avoids contradiction. Any other possibility possesses contradiction, right? Including an explanation of reality that does not require God. Any other possibility does not make sense other than an infinite, powerful and willed creator. And that's my claim, and the only thing, and my proof of that is it's the only one that avoids contradiction and yet explains reality.
Okay, let's leave it with that. 1 to 2 minute closing statements, starting with Colin.
Oh, sorry. Wasn't really expecting that. Okay,
Sorry,
well,
we can start with Alex, and then...
No, I'm happy to do it. It'll be very brief. There's an old Russian proverb that says, "It is good to know the truth, but it is better to be happy." And when you're talking about reality can be very unpleasant. Religion is very bad for talking about reality, but it's quite good for talking about happiness. So if happiness is more important to you than truth, then Islam, like any other religion, can protect you against reality. Otherwise, I suggest you stick with reality. Maybe unpleasant, but it is actually what should guide you.
Okay, closing statement, Abdullah.
Okay. Well, firstly, I want to thank my interlocutors on both sides. Thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to maybe future discussions with all of you. So I'll just kind of finish up by saying that I don't think my arguments have been, my four kind of problems that I've posed to atheists that have been kind of addressed, the explanation for change, matter, finitude, and specificity. These things haven't been explained. If this moment depended on an infinite amount of pre-existing moments with no beginning, no start point, then we wouldn't get to this point. And of course, if there is a start point, then the question is what's making this starting thing begin the chain of creation or causality or whatever, or continuously, whatever you want to call it. Well, if it's something else, then it's not the first thing. So if it's initiating, then it can only do so out of choice. And that's the only explanation that avoids any contradictions. And I think I'll kind of finish up by saying that I'm glad that science wasn't invoked necessarily on either side to prove either side's point. But I will say this, and just a slight kind of interesting observation. In the Quran commands Muslims to observe the world, to see how God made and instituted things, and Islamic science, well, science within Islamic civilization flourished because of it, with Islamic scientists citing the Quran as their motivation to understand God's will more, the second holy book of Islam, the universe, the ayat of Allah. But there's no command in atheism to do so. In fact, you could be a solipsist, a nihilist, or an existentialist, and not believe there's even an external reality in the first place. So I think with atheism, it's not a question of atheism is attached to science, but rather that atheism can't even justify an external reality to even investigate in the first place, whereas Islam is assured of one.
Okay.
You can also be an atheist and a horse rider. They have nothing to do with each other. Atheism doesn't entail certain beliefs, and you can be a solipsistic atheist, but you don't have to be a solipsistic atheist. You're right to say that the issues that you bring up, especially the 4 points you make, haven't been addressed. Perhaps they could have been if we could have gone to the end of the sentence. But I think that, likewise, the challenges that I proposed in my opening statements weren't fully addressed. The problems of morality, and I'd hate to compel or expect you to do so now in a closing statement. That would be unfair. But I hope that it hasn't escaped people that hasn't been discussed. And I think one of the reasons for that is because it can't be justifiably addressed. Although certainly Mr. Jab has tried to on his YouTube channel, so you should go and listen to what he has to say. I just have to say that appeals to the fact that, for instance, you say, America had laws that said you could get married at 10. It's like, yeah, America was wrong, and so was your prophet. Like, the difference is that whilst we can progress morally as a society, if we base it upon constitutions and say that the moral issues that are infused within them don't depend on the person who's saying it or the fact that it comes from God, that's a hell of a lot easier than when you come up against the possibility for moral progress with statements that come from the unalterable word of the divine creator of the universe. And that's where I'd probably leave it.
Can I stand up?
Yeah.
I'd like to stand up, please.
1 minute, Mohammed, don't go over yet.
No, it's not 1 minute because he had 2. I want to say.
Yeah, 1 minute. I was timing it.
Okay, let me add to. You said 1 or 2. Here's what I want to say, ladies and gentlemen. You see, this is the reality of atheism, where you have a claim, first of all, from a nihilist, someone who does epistemological nihilist, an existential nihilist, a moral nihilist, someone who does not believe in value judgments, saying you're right and you're wrong. That's unfair and it's unsubstantiated. That is an active claim that he's not been able to show from first principles. You see, the thing is, with atheists, they like to make claims that they cannot substantiate. He said himself, you can be an atheistic solipsist, which means you can, by the way, what that means is you can believe you're living in a matrix world. So if you can't even prove the external reality, or even an absolute reality, or even that rational faculties are truth reliable, then why are you making a claim that atheism, or trying to suggest that atheism potentially is better than Islam in understanding reality? If you don't make that claim, then you're conceding that Islam offers something, whereas atheism, by virtue of the fact, offers nothing. And to be honest with you, I have to say, I am actually convinced, I have some doubts after this debate. There's some skepticism. I doubt the existence of atheism, or atheists. Because if atheists, no seriously, because if atheist means someone who's lacking or disbelieving in God, what is a God? A God is an object of worship. What is worship? Worship is ultimate obedience to an entity. And I don't believe that any human being is not ultimately obedient, loving, submissive to anything. In fact, like Abdullah said, they're polytheists. That's what the Quran says, chapter 39, verse 29. Allah says in the Quran, He says,
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ضرب الله مثلا رجلا فيه شركاء متشاكسون ورجلا سلما لرجل هل يستويان مثلا الحمد لله بل أكثرهم لا يعلمون إنك ميت وإنهم ميتون ثم إنكم يوم القيامة عند ربكم تختصمون فمن أظلم ممن كذب على الله وكذب بآياته وكذب بالصدق إذ جاءه فمن أظلم ممن كذب على الله وكذب بالصدق إذ جاءه أليس في جهنم مثوى للكافرين. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, He says, ضرب الله مثلا, Allah has struck a parable, رجلا فيه شركاء, a man who has many different slave masters. وَرَجُلًا سَلَمًا لِرَجُلٍ, and another person, another man with only one slave master. Are they the same in comparison with each other? Alhamdulillah, praise be to Allah. بَلْ أَكْثَرُهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ, nay, most of them do not know. You're gonna die, i.e. Prophet Muhammad, and they are gonna die. Then you will be presented to Allah disputing with one another, i.e. on the day of judgment. Allah then says, and who is more oppressive than the one who denies God's signs and persistently denies His evidences when they are presented to him? Is there not in the hellfire a resting place for the oppressors?
Atheists have many gods. Muslims are just telling atheists to redirect their veneration, admiration, and their worship, instead of to the many gods, to the one God. And that is our case. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you everyone for coming. It's been a long night, but a very enjoyable one. Thank you very much.
Apologies for any passion or...
Oh, I'd expect it if you believe that you're right about these things.
Thank you for your
Of course, you
contribution. Thank you.
I'm still waiting for an answer to my question.
And you can still become an atheist.
No, it's all right. No, because...
Oh, sure.
Of course, that's a great idea.
Thank you very much. Just get the... And this office will...
Order of heights. I don't know who's taller.
in the middle.